Walker. Great. Okay. So, Dr. Gregg Walker, or as he told me.
Connie, it looks like Caroline Wilkins just joined.
Oh, sure. Oh, she did.
She was there and she wasn't there.
Okay. If she joins after I introduce him, we'll say hi to her. Dr. Gregg Walker is a professor of communication. We'll get to her in a minute. Of communication and an adjunct professor in environmental sciences, forestry, oceanography, public policy, and water resources programs at Oregon State University. He teaches courses in conflict, dispute resolution, and argumentation, and facilitates and studies environmental policy related collaboration efforts. He is co-author of Working Through Environmental Conflict, the Collaborative Learning Approach, and co-editor of Breaking Boundaries, Innovative Practices in Environmental Communication and Public Participation. Professor Walker is a member of the National Collaboration Cadre of the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution. He leads observer teams at UN climate change meetings for Mediators Beyond Borders International and the International Environmental Communication Association. So we welcome Dr. Walker, and I just want to say a shout out to Caroline Wilkins. Glad you could join us. Where are you at tonight, Caroline?
I'm in San Antonio.
Great. She normally isn't.
Where we're getting ready for Fiesta. And just got through with Easter. Then Mother's Day.
Great. All right. Great. So I'll turn it over to you, Gregg.
Well, Caroline, you may not remember me, but
I do.
Well, it's so nice to see you.
Good to see you. I recognized your name right away.
Well, thank you so much.
And I'm so happy you accepted our invitation.
Well, and we can all look back on our lives and think about people who had great influence. And there was this particular dean at Oregon State University who was one of my very favorite people. So Caroline, and yours too. So Pat Jarrett has just joined us. Should we get an introduction there?
Sure. So Pat, we've just introduced ourselves and I already introduced the speaker, but you can tell us where you're at, where you're from.
Hi, yes, I'm Pat Jarrett. I'm in Anchorage, and I've been in Zonta since 2006, and I'm really excited to join in tonight.
And I thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas. I have been everywhere that you are. I mean, all of you. I will tell you a brief little vignette. So I'm in Helena, Montana to work with the Montana Forest Collaboration Network. There are 23 community-based, multi-stakeholder forest management collaboratives in the state of Montana. And my colleague and I, who a good friend of mine and colleague, we've done a lot of work together. We're doing a series of workshops for national forests and the collaborative groups with which they work. And so that's why I'm here. And I'll be doing that workshop tomorrow and Friday. The other thing that you'll find interesting, just to give you a sense of how old I truly am, on my way here, I stopped in Boise. And on Monday evening, I had the pleasure of spending about 3 hours with one of my former high school students. I taught high school out of college in Nampa, Idaho for 5 years before I went back to graduate school. I'm a native of Minnesota, but I wanted to live in the West. And this young woman was one of my absolute best students and one of the best debaters, because I was a debate coach, among other things. And we've not seen each other in 47 years.
Wow.
And so we had a wonderful evening, and she's telling me all about her life, and she's asking me about mine, and she gave me a nice hug afterwards. So I guess the message I'm saying is, even if it's been 47 years, there may be some people in your life you want to reach out to, and it was really very, very fun. So a little bit of a personal aspect of this trip. So I have a whole bunch of slides, way too many, but I'm going to bring them up anyway. And what I'm going to do is talk through them without going through every bullet. In fact, some of them we'll skip through pretty quickly, so we get to more interesting discussion. But I do want to do a time check. As if I recall, Pete, you told me this is typically about an hour, or does
Yeah.
it go for 3 hours or 5 hours? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Typically about an hour. So I want to make sure we have a lot of time for discussion and focusing on Zonta International and how some of the ideas I share might relate to the interests that all of you have. So I'm going to pull up the shared screen, if I may, and make sure that what I have here is going to work. Or let's see, I think I have access to the shared screen. Yes,
You
I
do.
do.
You do.
So can everybody see that?
Yes, we see that you are now at the control of screen sharing. There you
Okay.
go.
I'm going to pull this up and just go through this. Did I get it right? This is District 8?
Yes, you got it
Oh,
right.
good. I got it right. So you've already heard this before. People often say to me, how did I get involved in all of this? Well, I've been teaching international negotiation for over 30 years at Oregon State, but until I had access to the United Nations system, everything I taught was secondhand. Intel, Hewlett Packard, Nike, they weren't allowing me to tag along when they would negotiate international agreements. And the US State Department just doesn't let any old professor wander in. But the United Nations system claims to be relatively transparent. And so it provides access to people like us to observe the negotiations. So I started doing that quite a long time ago. And when I did that, I did it through Mediators Beyond Borders International. This is an international peace building group that was founded in 2008, and I joined in 2009. And a lot of us who have been mediators and facilitators throughout our career and want to give something back, we do pro bono work around the world. And my work with climate change is pro bono. MBBI doesn't give me any money. Oregon State doesn't give me any money. So it's pro bono kind of work. But the other group that I lead is the International Environmental Communication Association. Now, my point of this is that if you wanted to go to any of these UN meetings, for example, I'll be in Bonn, Germany for 2 weeks in June. I'll be in Baku, Azerbaijan for 2 weeks in November. The only way you can participate is if you get a badge. And badges come in 3 different forms. One, a badge if you're part of a country delegation. Well, none of us would get to be part of the US delegation. Second, if we're part of the media. And third, if we get a badge from a civil society organization, and there are about 1,500 of them last count that have been accredited by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I lead 2 of those teams, and I'm responsible for allocating badges, kind of coaching the new people, a variety of things. In addition to that, I've been involved in a constituency called RINGO, which is Research and Independent NGOs. But the constituency that would interest, I think, all of you the most would be the Women and Gender constituency. And I'll refer to that a little bit later. I participated in over 50 United Nations climate change meetings since 2009. And I've been at every one of these Conference of the Parties since Copenhagen, most recently in Dubai. And as I said, I'll be in Baku, Azerbaijan in November. And again, I'm happy to share that whole experience, talk about it some if you're interested. Now, what I have here, and we can zip through pretty quickly, is really key events. Sometimes people say, well, this climate change stuff, why are we dealing with it now? Well, this is something I didn't know until I really started researching this about 25 years ago. The first World Climate Conference occurred in 1979, sponsored by the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Organization. And then 1988, which I did know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up. But what was interesting was, if you go to the next slide, was 1992. Some of you may remember the Earth Summit, which was a big deal. It was toward the tail end of George H.W. Bush's presidency, and he called himself the environmental president. Some of you may remember that. And at the Earth Summit, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was actually open for signature. Parties agreed to it, and it committed all nations to take action. That was 1992. President Bush signed the instrument of ratification, sent it to the US Senate, and the vote, I think, was 99-0. Republicans and Democrats alike all agreed the US had to be involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So as polarized as this issue seemingly has become in our current political environment, it wasn't a polarizing issue in 1992. The Republican president was behind it. Republican leadership and Democrat leadership in the Senate, which ratifies treaties, also endorsed it. There was a time when both parties and the presidency all recognized this was an issue to deal with. I pointed that out, by the way, to some of my Republican friends, and they're often in a state of shock when I tell them that it was, in fact, George H.W. Bush and a prominent group of Republican senators who supported us getting involved in climate change. And they'll look at me kind of like with deer in the headlights view and think, oh, I didn't know that. Okay, well, now you do. It used to be a bipartisan issue. So the first COP was 1995 in Berlin. But what we probably all are aware of is the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. That was during the Clinton-Gore administration, and Vice President Al Gore led the U.S. delegation to Kyoto for the third COP, and he was instrumental in the negotiations to create the Kyoto Protocol. And what the Kyoto Protocol basically did was set targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions among maybe the 20 biggest polluters in the world, which of course the U.S. has always been a prominent one of those. Now, this is a list that we don't need to go through in detail, except that what I want to point out is that if you look at 2001, that was the first time the issue of adaptation really became part of the negotiations. Up until 2001, so for almost a decade after the climate change agreement was put together, the talk was about mitigation, but then it became adaptation. And that's actually a foundation for women's issues that I'll address a little bit later. And then you can see there are a number of other things here. And again, we can talk about any of these details, but I gave you this timeline because the progress has been steady but incremental, because again, you're trying to get almost 200 countries to agree to something. So the other thing that I wanted to mention was, of course, this all led to the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was really a watershed event and was a success in the sense that countries agreed, even though the language was quite general, and they're still working on implementing the Paris Agreement. But that was a really big deal. And so it took years for parties to get to that point where they could agree on at least a very general framework for global climate action. So again, you can see that timetable there. What I wanted to mention here is, and I don't know why it says 2019 to 2021, it should be to 2023. That's my own typo. What is important to note here is that over the years, there's been greater public awareness of climate change, and particularly when, and this is something we all know, whether we're in Victoria, BC, or Pocatello, Idaho, or where Pete is down in Arizona, everywhere we live, we know that we're dealing with more significant, more extreme, more catastrophic events, whether it's wildfire. You might have been following the flooding that's been happening in Russia, for example, right now in Kazakhstan. And of course, we know about extreme floods that have happened in Europe recently. We think about the superstorms that are not just in the US, but the Philippines, which is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And the events are more catastrophic than they've been. And we know the spinoff that happens to this is things like in Florida, it's really hard to get homeowners insurance now, depending upon where you live. When these things happen, it creates an opportunity for us to have conversations about wildfire risk or about the risk coming from hurricanes or whatever it might be. And of course, there are climate science reports, there are high expectations for these meetings, and every one I go to, you can see some progress is made. Now, what are some of the recent outcomes at these Conference of the Parties meetings that we hear about, like Dubai? Well, by the end of the Glasgow meeting, COP26, which was in 2021, countries had submitted new climate plans. These as NDCs or national. I've been working in the environmental policy since really 1992. And I can tell you that you might think that government or its agencies have a lot of acronyms. Nobody comes close to so many acronyms in the UN negotiations as experienced as I am, I'm not sure I are. But one of them is the NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. And fundamentally what this is, an agreement that came initially out of in 2013 and was finalized in the Paris Agreement. It basically said every single develop a comprehensive national climate action plan. The US has done that. Now, again, because all of this occurs in the political environment, the Obama administration put together an NDC and of course decided to junk it. So we're kind of back with the Biden administration rebuilding the climate action plan. And one of the reasons why Belém in Brazil in 2025 is considered a watershed event, determined contributions or national climate action plans are supposed to be updated. So to an updated version from 2015 to 2025. And that's a big deal. Now, there's some other things here. These we don't need to go into great detail. We can revisit. I would say the most difficult issue that these negotiators face is it's climate finance. And imagine how difficult it is, particularly when developing countries are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, produce very little in the way. So they look to developed countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, the European Union, for them to be resilient to the threats from climate change, and in other words, being able and be more resilient when it comes to kind of catastrophic events that are affecting their countries. Now, getting all the way back to Copenhagen, made promises of a lot of money. Again, the Obama years, a lot of money coming from the US during the Trump years, really none at all. The administration has been putting more money into what is often called the Green Climate Fund, agreed to in Copenhagen, but has never reached its goal of countries. So one of the big issues, and I think we can all relate to this, that has been for years, was the issue of loss and damage. And the way I explain this to my students when I teach about the climate in this country and Canada as well, the US, we have we can use when there's a catastrophic event. So whether it's a tsunami, or wildfire, we have in the US, the federal emergency. Countries typically have that. I'm sure there's an equivalent in Canada as well, given how the catastrophic here. Philippines doesn't have that. Bangladesh doesn't have that. Caribbean countries don't have that. So developing countries have said, we in effect need an international, we need developed countries to fund it. Well, you can imagine, again, we get back into finance issues. In Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in 2022, there was a breakthrough kind of international mechanism to deal with loss and damage. And then, of course, the issue in Dubai last year. So there are also the things that you'll notice learning about the UN negotiations and so many times, the importance of a single word. And I have one example here. The majority of the country, probably 90% of the countries, agreed to language in the Glasgow Agreement that fossil fuels would be phased. Arabia objected. India objected. The Russian Federation objected to that language. So the compromise was that fossil fuel. And that was very significant, and it upset a lot of people that despite the climate crisis, to set a target date to phase out fossil fuels. So you can imagine, again, the negotiations might come down to a particular sentence or even a single word. are so slow at these UN negotiations. I should tell you that, and this is on the slide, like I will in Baku, and like I did in Dubai or Sharm el-Sheikh or Glasgow, I always have new these things before, and I try to do my best to coach them, to help these UN meetings. And the metaphor that I use is one of a carnival. And I don't, a carnival. So that if you go to one of these meetings, let's say Baku, Azerbaijan, on the negotiations, you'd probably come away across the hall, so to speak, and there are these pavilions that are run by a lot of countries, and they feature all sorts of cool projects happening all over the world for governments to act. And now you feel pretty optimistic. And then we have side events, we have exhibits, climate action that is occurring all over the world. So the negotiations, though, are slow. One, there are a lot of issues to discuss, and the agenda has expanded substantially since that. The second reason is the UN system uses a consensus process. Two countries object, you go back to the drawing board, you work through that objection, and can conceivably hold up the negotiations. And it often means that the language, even as you try to reach agreement. So a couple of different reasons why slow pace of progress. And if you want to explain this, do it the way I do. When I do this with my students, I say, now imagine for a moment to have a family reunion, every second and third cousin, every aunt and uncle, every parent, members of your family, and you're all going to be together for a week at some resorts. Have a successful family, you all have to agree on the menu for each day ahead of time. You imagine how difficult that would be to get agreement on the menus for 200 people happening with these negotiations. We're trying to get 200 countries, or almost 200 countries, to agree on. Explore that in more detail if you'd like. So the challenges I've already mentioned, how 5 or 197 or 98 parties, and then common but differentiated responsibility. This is in the original 1992 agreement. All the parties agreed that everybody has a responsibility in the climate crisis, but the responsibility is different. They're still debating what that means. And people will look to the United States and say, you know what, you and China now are the top two emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. You two countries really need to step up to the plate and provide a lot of resources to the most vulnerable countries in the world. And the US will pull back and say, well, we'll do what we can, but we're not the only ones responsible. And so you get into debate, what does it mean to say we all have a stake in this, but our responsibilities are different? So it was a principle that they agreed to, but operationally, it still is a difficult issue. Then there are these issues that have emerged in the last few years, including issues around the voices of indigenous communities and human rights issues, which relate to that. Issues related to gender equality, issues related to disability concerns, engagement of youth, a variety of issues that were never part of the early negotiations, but now feature pretty prominently. So the big target now is Belém. Even though we're going to Baku in November, people are saying that's kind of a stepping stone to Belém. And the reason why it really is that, because these national climate plans, or that I'd mentioned before, or NDCs, are all going to be updated by Belém. But a lot of the work of the UNFCCC also occurs in what is referred to as specialized meetings or constituted bodies. The Adaptation Committee, the Standing Committee on Finance, the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And these are groups that may have 12 or 15 or 20 members from countries around the world, and they meet a couple times a year And I'm an observer at 2 of them. I've been a regular observer of the Adaptation Committee. I just got back from 2 weeks in Germany where I participated in meetings of the Adaptation Committee. And I'm a regular observer, participant observer in the meetings of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And that's where a lot of work gets done that then gets sent to these conference of the parties for the countries to focus on. So let's turn our attention, though, for the last maybe 5 minutes to you and Zonta. Now, I've been on the website. Pete and I had a real good meeting about this. And as I was going through the website, I thought, what is it about Zonta International that, to me, now again, you're all far more knowledgeable than I am, so you can make all these corrections. This is just me getting familiar with what your work is. And when I looked at the causes of Zonta, these 3 are ones that jumped out at me related to climate change: advocating for gender equality, being an informed advocate, and of course, gender equal climate action. And then I looked at the programs of Zonta, and the ones again that stood out to me that relate to climate change. One is education. Another is women in business and STEM fields, and then local service and advocacy. Now, you might want to modify that list, but I thought there's some, what I learned about Zonta, there are some aspects of Zonta International that I think directly relate to not only what happens with the UN system, but just climate action generally. And then I thought I'd share with you a little bit about gender issues in the UN negotiations. And this is really interesting to me because, as I said, I started following the climate change negotiations in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, and I wasn't able to attend anything until 2009. When I went to Copenhagen in 2009, gender was not prominent, but Cristina Figueres became the executive secretary, and she's just a marvelous person, absolutely amazing person. And this was a priority of hers to bring gender issues. Now I will share with you a bias I have. I've traveled a fair amount internationally. I've met people from all over the world through these climate meetings. I've been involved in a lot of climate conferences and negotiations. And I think at the community level, at the local level, the primary agents of change are women more than men. And that was a point that Cristina Figueres made. If climate action, it doesn't mean that women aren't prominent in every level of government or every level of business in some countries, but almost a cultural universal is that at the local level, women are absolutely critical agents of change. And that was a point that Cristina Figueres said. And she said, if we're going to help communities adapt and become more resilient, then we really need to empower women in their roles as community organizers, as community leaders, to be able to be very, very, very prominent in these efforts. So what has then happened? Now the UN negotiations, it'll happen in Azerbaijan, it happened in Dubai, it happened in Sharm el-Sheikh. There will be a Women and Gender Day, which will feature programs throughout the negotiations, throughout the venue on the actions of women related to climate action or climate change. It's prominent in the work of every constituted body. So when I go to these adaptation committee meetings or the standing committee or the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, in their work plan, there is explicit reference to how do we address adaptation relative to the human rights of women and empowering women in key agents of change roles. And there are 9 civil society constituencies in the UN system. One is called Youngo, which is youth NGOs. Another is called Bingo, business and industry NGOs. I'm a member of Ringo, research and independent NGOs. And one of them is the Women and Gender constituency, which once again is very influential, very prominent in the process. That leads us to, again, something that I think is very important to all of you, and that is, what about citizen action? And this is something that's not unique to Zonta. It's for all of us to consider what we can do. How can we create opportunities for conversations around climate change? Now, I always love to tell a story here. I'm in Montana working with this Montana Forest Collaboration Network, but I've worked with communities on natural resource, environmental collaboration kind of work for over 30 years. And if we go back to 2016, I was actually in Pine working with the Sublette County Commissioners to establish a community-based forest collaborative. And I was having breakfast with one of the county commissioners who was a few years older than me and a multi-generation rancher. and pretty conservative. That part of Wyoming's pretty conservative politically. And we're having breakfast, and I just said to him, I said, tell me about changes you've seen on your ranch in the last 30, 40 years. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, are you getting as much rain as you used to? He said, oh, no, we're not getting as much rain. What about when you're grazing cattle on federal land? You have to go a little bit higher up the mountain? Yeah, we have to get good grass. And what about the health of these forests that are adjacent to your ranch? Oh, yeah, they're not as healthy as they used to be, a lot of bug kill. And I went through all of these things, and I looked at him and I said, do you think any of that has to do with climate change? And he looked at me and he said, you got me. And the reason is that I didn't try to debate him on the science of climate change. I wanted him to share his experiences on what he's seen. And that opened a space for a conversation with him about what ranching communities can do, what rural communities can do. And of course, I don't need to share that with you. You all understand the importance, certainly, of actions at every scale, but certainly local climate action is really critical. I think one of the things that would be an interesting project for any of us to do, and I've had some students do this with me, is to look at the climate action plans that we have in our communities, whether it's Victoria or British Columbia, whether it's Pocatello, or whether it's the state of Idaho or Roseburg or the state of Oregon. A lot of communities, counties, and states have developed climate action plans. Some of you may be very familiar with them. Maybe you've participated in their development. Most of them, at least the ones I've studied, emphasize, that's my typo there, mitigation much more than adaptation. Electric buses, for example, putting solar panels on government buildings, doing things to reduce the carbon footprint of a community. There's been less attention paid to adaptation and not a lot of attention paid to climate justice or just transition or concerns related to women and gender and youth aspects. We could do a lot more in those climate action plans around those issues. And so I want to wrap up by saying things that I think resonate well with you, and you already know that if we're really concerned about the climate crisis and we wonder what we can do, we can act personally and think about our own lifestyle choices. We can act locally, as I'm sure you all have done. You get involved in local affairs, and we can act internationally. We can make sure that the people we elect understand it's important for the U.S. to play a prominent role, no matter who's in the presidency, no matter who's in Congress. And we need to invest in civil society organizations. And one that I'm involved with is one founded by former Vice President Al Gore called the Climate Reality Project. And if you want to know more about that, I'd be happy to tell you about it. You could all become climate reality leaders, something I am, and I can tell you how to do that. And then the challenges ahead. This is one of the things that struck me. If we go back pre-pandemic, there were people who would get climate change referenda or ballot initiatives, and we thought they'd probably pass, but they didn't. And they didn't in part because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the climate change. Now, maybe in 2024, this would be different, but I think it's important for us to look at ways that we can institutionalize constructive climate action, but at every level, but not be content with that particular path. So I've gone through a lot of material relatively quickly. I'm going to look at my, and I'm a little bit over time, but I'm going to stop there. And certainly we've got about, I think by my watch, about 25 minutes left. And I see some things in the chat, and it looks like we had some feed issues. But I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to get out of this and simply invite your comments, your stories, your experiences. So I always appreciate anybody who's willing to listen to me.
Thank you so much. Yes, please do. If people have questions or comments, I see Anita has her hand up. Oh, you're muted, Claudia.
I have to keep muted, else I always say, yes, yes, yes. I just wanted to thank our speaker, Dr. Gregg, for this wonderful overview and for all he is doing, because we have to hold both the politicians and all these negotiators with their feet to the fire so that they really do the job that has to be done. I don't know, we were talking about it before, that just now, older women in Switzerland have won a wonderful
Yeah.
lawsuit, and I am triumphant. Did you hear about it, Dr. Gregg?
Yeah, it was,
Just was yesterday.
and go ahead and explain it to the group. I don't know that other people know about it.
Well, it is that a group of older Swiss women have taken the Swiss government to court, to the European Human Rights Court, and said that because the government hasn't done enough to mitigate climate change or to prevent further climate change, they are suffering health
Yeah.
issues. And they have won.
They won.
And that opens quite a lot of doors, apparently.
Well, and you're probably all familiar with lawsuits that young
Yeah.
people.
The young people in Colorado. Was it in Colorado? Where was it?
Yep, exactly. And it speaks to the fact that climate action can take so. We all have to kind of look at our own, you know, the time we.
You're cutting out a little bit.
I'll give you one example with the Climate Reality Project. The Climate Reality Project was founded by Al Gore, and back in 2020, reality all over the country developed a letter writing campaign. Swing states, and basically sent postcards and letters to thousands of voters in Georgia, hoping to influence a little bit. And basically, an issue, President Biden supports this, President Trump doesn't, whatever. Now, did that make it? Probably didn't hurt.
Yeah.
And again, it's for some people who is homebound because of a disability and can't necessarily go to meetings or go to more postcards than any of the rest of us, because that was something that person could do, and that was
good idea.
Where we can put our energy, whatever the scale, whatever the scope, make a difference.
You're still breaking up a little bit, Greg. I don't know why, but.
Well, in addition to postcards, there's a lot of petitions that people can sign just to get behind certain issues. I know that writing to legislators, whether it be state or national, if they get enough of them, they pay attention. So our voices do matter.
Yeah, and our campaign to sue big oil is taking off here in my neighborhood. More and more municipalities are accepting it or underwriting it for us, which helps.
One of the challenges that I've had on some other issues, and I don't know if it's the same, but when I've tried to send an email to the Republican House of Speaker, I'm not allowed to because I'm not from his state. So it really tends to make it more challenging. But I know that some advocacy groups, like the Zonta is involved with a fast action group, and they're able to send it. But I think actually they just end up sending it to our individual representatives, but they're doing it across the country.
I've had the same experience. I would write letters to a Republican senator in somewhere or a representative, and I'd get something that said, you're not in our district or you're not in our state, so you don't matter. But financially, we can give money to anybody we want to. One of the things I've thought about, and I think it's Pam was in Pocatello. I'm very fond of the state of Idaho, but I lived there when Frank Church was a senator and Cecil Andrus was governor, and those two would not get elected today, sadly. But I worked a little bit with the Idaho Farm Bureau, and I've worked with some agriculture groups in Oregon with the Oregon Dairy Farmers Association. Politically, a lot of these people are conservative, but when they're also practical. And so you sometimes can say, well, you know, the Idaho Farm Bureau has to be concerned with climate change. I drove yesterday from Boise across by Craters of the Moon and then over to Du Bois and then up here. I'm going by potato fields. And I still see on the license plates in Idaho, famous potatoes. Well, the potato harvest is affected by the climate crisis. And we could say that about just about any agricultural area. So the Idaho Farm Bureau, again, it's like that conversation I had with the county commissioner in Wyoming. You can debate the climate science, or you can say, what's the reality in front of us? What are we doing about it?
Right.
And that might be a way that you get at it. I'll tell you one other thing. I guess about 12 years ago, I was in China, and I was doing a workshop at a conservation biology conference, a day-long workshop on environmental decision-making. And about half of the people in the class were graduate students from Chinese universities. These were young women and young men from China. And they were with me for a day. And so we all went to lunch together, and I asked them about a political protest. And one of the young women said, well, you know, in China, we can't protest the government. We can't bring up human rights, but we can protest environmental issues. And I said, why do you think that is? Well, because the Chinese government is very concerned about looking good environmentally, and we've got all these pollution problems and terrible air quality issues in some of our big cities. In a way, that's strategic for any of us to say, okay, we're in a conservative area, we're in a small town, or we've got people who have all these biases or judgments about whatever. How do we relate what matters to us, like empowering women as leaders, for example, that can be consistent with some of the things that politician X, Y, or Z, whether it's a county commissioner or whether it's a state representative or someone at the federal level. That's something that my students and I have talked a lot about, because they'll say to me kind of the same thing. If we're in Oregon and we have these people who are doing this, or California, but Idaho's different or Utah's different, how do we develop a momentum regardless of the kind of the political identity of the state? And that's a good question.
Greg, could you talk a little bit more about the difference between mitigation and adaptation?
Sure. The mitigation fundamentally is, how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And one of the big debates that have gone on at the UN meetings for literally 20 years has to do with things like carbon offsets or carbon credits. And again, I'll give you a real simple example. I do travel a lot, and I get on airplanes. And sometimes my friends and students say, how can you do that? You're doing all this climate change work. And part of it, to relieve my guilt, I give a lot of money to a particular foundation that was founded by the late Wangari Maathai. If you know Wangari Maathai, she was a Nobel Peace Prize winner many years ago. And she was the first woman in East Africa to earn a PhD. And she started a foundation called the Greenbelt Movement, which plants trees all over the world. And I give them a fair amount of money. And of course, why? Well, trees, of course, function as carbon sinks. And so if we have healthier forests, healthier landscapes of trees, that's an important way to reduce or absorb the greenhouse gases. When all this stuff started back in, again, you go back to the 1980s and 90s, it really was about how do we basically reduce greenhouse gas emission. Now, I'm going to add one thing to that, but now an adaptation is different. Adaptation recognizes that the change is happening, that even if we're able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to pay attention to the most vulnerable areas and the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable communities, and help them adapt to the changes that are happening and will continue to happen. And in very simple terms, for any of us who've spent time in coastal areas, we can think about sea level rise. And our communities, in fact, going to be able to adapt to sea level rise. Or our community is going to be like forests in the Pacific Northwest, going to be able to adapt when 1 or 2 or 3 degree average increase puts more stress on trees and makes forests more vulnerable to certain infestations, certain non-invasive species, for example. So invasive species. So adaptation is a reality. just as we know in the last 20 years, I always say this to my students, think about how in the last 10 years, social media has changed, how the internet has changed. Now, and I'm going to retire from Oregon State before too long. And you know what? I'm getting out before the AI situation explodes. And I'm glad for that. As a professor, I don't know that I want to deal with Chat GPT and all that AI has going, because there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Well, we learn to adapt. We've all adapted throughout our lives. And so adaptation isn't a reason to ignore reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but simply reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not enough. I'm going to add one thing to that, and this is where the two come together. There's a term that I teach my students, and maybe you all know it really well, but this is where, again, so I think Zonta International could really focus some of your work. It's on the concept of just transition, and it relates directly to climate justice.
Yes.
The concept of just transition, and I think, again, this is something I'm sure you all are familiar with, it really deals with how do we help people and communities transition away from fossil fuels. And an example I give my students is, I'm not going to blame coal miners because they were coal miners.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to instead say, you know what, we need to phase out coal. We need to get rid of coal-fired power plants, but we can't vilify the coal miner. We can't vilify the coal-dependent communities. We have to help them make a transition to a post-fossil fuel economy. If we don't, we make enemies of them. And so just transition is a term that, again, was not part of the early discussions in these negotiations, but now it's become very, very prominent, and it's related to many issues under the umbrella of climate justice. So probably, Pete, a lot longer answer than you asked for. That's pretty true.
I think that was a great answer. That was very good, very clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Others, I know Pat lives in Alaska, which is a challenging area in lots of ways. I didn't know if you had any comments or questions.
I guess I don't. I just know we're on the cutting edge of climate change up here, especially along the coastlines. And yet we are still trying to pull more fossil fuels out of the ground. So there's that.
Well, and Pat, that's one of the real challenges, because I mean, Alaska's economy has benefited a lot from oil and gas development. I mean, the permanent dividend fund that people use to get a trip to Hawaii. I've worked a lot in Southeast Alaska with the Tongass National Forest, and I've worked a lot in South Central Alaska with the Chugach National Forest. And of course, Alaska is a very diverse state geographically, but also has Native Alaskan communities that whose economies, whose way of life will be affected. And yet Alaskans are very pragmatic. When I'm up there working with the Forest Service, I have people say, you know, why is the Forest Service hiring some guy from the lower 48, and they say the lesser 48, you know, from Oregon, even though we Oregonians love Alaska and think you're our cousins. You don't necessarily, but the whole point is that these are areas where my students say this, by the way. In fact, I'll deviate because it relates to Alaska. I get asked all the time how I can stay optimistic about the climate crisis. And my primary answer is in my students. This is something you might find interesting. I've taught at Oregon State for 37 years. And I teach a class every year, every term, that enrolls about 250 students. It's called Argument and Critical Discourse. It's in our general education core. It's a critical thinking class. And they get a heavy dose of climate change examples. And I've asked my students, these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, about the political environment. And here's what they've told me in the last 5 years. They've said, from their standpoint, there are two issues that should be bipartisan. We should not polarize these issues. Everybody should pull together and address them. One is the climate crisis. It's not a Republican-Democrat issue to my students. It might be to my generation, but it's not to my students. They say, we have to deal with this. Shouldn't politicize it, just got to figure it out. The other is public health, AKA the pandemic. And I find that real hopeful. especially when they say we need to attack the climate crisis regardless of our political affiliation or who our parents or grandparents voted for. And Alaska, I think, is that way. You know, when I've spent a lot of time in Alaska and I have a number of friends there, Alaska has to be one of the most practical states I've ever been in. And people, I've been able to see work in communities that, again, people kind of put aside their political differences that may play out nationally. And locally, they say, we've got to pull together and make sure that this community continues to survive and thrive. And I don't
Right.
know, Pat, if that's your experience. You're in Anchorage, and Anchorage is, of course, more cosmopolitan. It's a pretty big city. When I'm down in places like Homer or Seward, it's or even up in Eagle River, it's a little bit different vibe.
Yeah, we say that Anchorage is 10 minutes away from Alaska. We've got 2 ways out of town. So,
I've never heard that one.
but we have moose wandering through our yard and
Oh
that
yeah,
thing. Yeah, Eagle River is its own, has its own flavor, which is different than Palmer and Wasilla.
Yeah.
And
Or
it seems like the further
Ketchikan, you
north,
know. Yeah.
the further north you go, the more conservative things have become in the last 5 to 10 years. And some maybe more radicalized for some of our elected officials, which have become an embarrassment. But Claudia has a question, it looks like.
This is a practical question to Professor Walker. We have tremendous problems with the pine beetle that has affected not only BC's forests, it has jumped over the Rocky Mountain barrier. It's now in the boreal forest in Canada and killing more and more trees. And of course, that contributes to some extent also to, apart from all the other stuff that Canada does to promote, not to do anything about changing the climate problem. Do you have problems where you are just now, when you talk to the forest people in where you are just now? Do you have pine beetle infestations in the United States, lower states, too?
Yes, and the Oregon, where I live, they're doing that in Montana. There are a lot of different reasons for it. Part of it has to do with forest management. When there were clear cuts and then new forests were planted and they were monoculture, so you do all, and that was not healthy. But I'll tell you something interesting. That management, the Forest Service, I worked with the Environmental Protection Agency, Army Corps of Engineers. So maybe this is happening in Canada as well. During the Obama years, all the agencies that were basically told to revise their management plans to account for. When Trump came in, that all changed, but under Biden, it's back. And so it means that from the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest, I work with people from the Custer Gallatin National Forest. I work with those forests operate according to a management plan, and they've had to go to see where their management, where their plans, their guidance, if have to account for changes in climate. And I think that's an important thing to do. And I think, again, that's not of our elected officials, but of our civil servants, to see that the work issues, to make sure that they're taking the time to account deal with it. Once again, it's probably more around adaptation than it is mitigation. But even mitigation practice of government agencies.
Thank you very, very much.
So we're almost at the 8 o'clock hour. Are there any final comments or thoughts for Dr. Walker, who we greatly appreciate taking the time to talk to us?
I would like to say that I am encouraged to hear hopeful messages. Sometimes we get I get off of these meetings and I'm like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to sign on next month because it's too depressing. And what can I do? But I am encouraged to hear that the young people are taking this seriously. And, you know, we've left them a mess. You know, they're the ones that are going to have to clean this up, or their kids, if they choose to have any kids, are going to be really screwed. So this is helpful. Thank you.
And if you're interested in something that I've really enjoyed, you might Google the Climate Reality Project. It does trainings both virtually and in person. It's doing its next in-person training, but it's done during the pandemic. It did trainings completely online. It's done them all over the world. They're climate reality leader, but you don't have to pay anything. I mean, obviously, when I got trained actually in Australia, but there have been programs around the US and again, virtually. There's no registration fee. Any of us.
I did it. That's how I got involved in the climate movement, is I attended the Climate Reality Project training.
Well, and so Connie is our reference now. If you want to know more about the Climate Reality Project, yes, you can talk to Connie. Well, congrats. You're a kindred spirit, Connie.
Yes, absolutely.
We're climate reality.
Bellevue in 2017,
right.
I think.
I had great. That's great. So anyway, if you're interested, talk to Connie about it. I think it's a good investment of our time.
It is. I mean, that's after that is when I started doing a little bit of the trainings that I've done through the years.
Yeah.
Yep. All right.
So Greg, would you be willing to put your contact information in the chat? So if folks want to,
and it's on that slide that maybe is part of the recording, but I'd be happy to.
Yeah, maybe that'd be good. We
I'll
are
do
gonna
that right now.
This is being recorded, but the person that is going to transfer it to YouTube is out of the country right now, so it might take a few weeks.
There.
All right, everybody see
that?
that?
Until I retire.
G. Walker at OregonState.edu. All right.
6 years ago, I'll say one thing. But about 6 years ago, I took career. I would teach every single class in a Hawaiian shirt, and I was honored that you asked me to join.
So Greg, after almost 40 years, it's been great to be in your classroom again.
Well, thank you, Pete.
Yes, thank you so much.
Pete. That's very kind.
That's very interesting.
So much.
Thank you.
I will now stop the recording.